In 1935, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known across Harlem as Bumpy, controlled more than territory. He controlled perception. He was not the loudest voice in the room. He was not the man who needed to prove himself with every insult or slight. By the middle of the decade, Bumpy Johnson had built a reputation that rested not on chaos, but on calculated discipline. Men feared him not because he was unpredictable, but because he was precise. When Bumpy acted, it was deliberate. When he chose not to act, that silence carried its own weight. Bumpy Johnson had arrived in Harlem from South Carolina as a teenager, escaping a South where violence against black people was casual and legal. He had witnessed lynchings. He had seen black men humiliated in public with no recourse. He had watched his own family navigate a world where a wrong word to a white person could mean death. He came to New York believing the North would be different, and in some ways it was. There were no signs declaring which water fountains black people could use. There were no laws requiring separate train cars. But the racism was still there, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that were sometimes harder to see, but just as destructive. New York segregated black people through economics and social custom rather than explicit law. Landlords refused to rent to black families in white neighborhoods. Employers refused to hire black workers for most professional positions. Restaurants and hotels turned black customers away with excuses that everyone understood. Police treated black neighborhoods as occupied territory, using violence freely and investigating crimes against black victims with indifference or hostility. The courts were no better. A black person's word meant little against a white person's testimony. Justice was not blind. It saw color clearly and ruled accordingly. Harlem became a refuge because it was one of the few places in the city where black people could live with some measure of autonomy. By the 1930s, Harlem was home to hundreds of thousands of black residents, many of them migrants from the South seeking better opportunities. The neighborhood had its own businesses, churches, social clubs, and cultural institutions. The Harlem Renaissance had brought national attention to black artists, writers, and musicians. But beneath the cultural flowering was grinding poverty, overcrowded housing, and economic exploitation. Most legitimate businesses were still owned by white people who lived elsewhere. The money generated in Harlem flowed out of the neighborhood into white hands. The illegal economy filled some of that gap. Policy operations, also called the numbers game, were the largest source of black-owned business in Harlem. People bet small amounts on three-digit numbers, hoping to win payouts that could change their lives. The odds were long, but the dream was powerful, and the system employed thousands of people as runners, collectors, and managers. The operations generated millions of dollars annually, and that money stayed in black hands, at least initially. Later, Italian organized crime families would try to take over the policy operations, leading to violent conflicts. But in 1935, the numbers game was still largely controlled by black operators, and Bumpy Johnson was connected to some of the most successful. Bumpy did not run his own operation at that point in his life. He was too young and had not yet accumulated the capital or connections required. But he worked for people who did, and he worked with intelligence and discipline that set him apart. He collected money, enforced debts, and handled disputes. He was good at reading people, at knowing when to push and when to back off. He understood that violence was a tool, not a default response. Too much violence brought police attention. It created enemies and instability. Bumpy preferred to resolve problems through negotiation when possible, and when violence was necessary, he made sure it was targeted and effective. This approach required self-control that many men in his position lacked. The criminal world in Harlem was full of people who were quick to anger, quick to reach for weapons, quick to create chaos that ultimately hurt everyone involved. Bumpy was different. He had a temper, but he controlled it. He had pride, but he did not let it drive him into stupid decisions. He watched and learned from other men's mistakes. He saw how people who acted impulsively ended up dead or in prison, and he determined not to follow that path. By 1935, Bumpy had a reputation for being reliable, disciplined, and smart. People trusted him to handle difficult situations. They knew he would not steal from them, would not run his mouth to police, would not create unnecessary problems. This reputation made him valuable. And being valuable meant earning money and building connections. Bumpy dressed well. He was calm in his manner. He spoke clearly and did not waste words. People who met him for the first time often underestimated him because he did not fit the stereotype of a street criminal. He did not swagger or shout. He did not display weapons. But people who knew him understood that the quiet exterior concealed someone who was extremely dangerous when circumstances required it. Bumpy's family life was deliberately separate from his criminal work. He had married Mamie Hatcher, a woman who was educated and dignified, someone who represented stability and respectability. Mamie knew what Bumpy did for a living. She was not naive about the risks. But Bumpy made sure she was insulated from the worst of it. She did not attend criminal gatherings. She did not socialize with the wives and girlfriends of other criminals. She maintained her own life, her own circle of friends, her own sense of dignity. This separation was important to Bumpy. It allowed him to keep part of his life clean, untouched by the corruption and violence that surrounded him every day. When their daughter was born, Bumpy became even more protective. He did not want his child growing up exposed to the criminal world. He did not want her witnessing violence or hearing the kinds of conversations that filled his working hours. He wanted her to have a normal childhood, to go to school, to have friends, to be shielded from the knowledge of what her father did. This was not entirely possible, of course. People in Harlem knew who Bumpy was. His daughter would eventually learn. But for as long as he could manage it, Bumpy tried to keep her innocent, to let her be a child without the weight of his reputation. This protective instinct was not unusual among men in Bumpy's position. Criminal figures often tried to separate their families from their work. But Bumpy took it further than most. He enforced strict rules. His wife and daughter did not appear in public with him unless it was absolutely necessary. They did not go to nightclubs or gambling houses. They did not get involved in disputes or confrontations. Bumpy's reputation was built on the understanding that his family was off limits. People who worked with him knew not to mention them. People who might have considered threatening them understood that doing so would bring consequences far beyond the usual criminal retaliation. In the spring of 1935, Bumpy was walking with his wife and daughter in a commercial district near Harlem. The exact location varies in different accounts, but it was an area where black and white New Yorkers both shopped and conducted business. These boundary zones were common in the city, places where segregation was informal rather than absolute, but where racial tensions always simmered just beneath the surface. Black people could shop in these areas, but they were often watched suspiciously by store owners. They were sometimes followed by staff who assumed they were thieves. They were spoken to rudely or ignored entirely. These small humiliations were constant, and most black people had learned to endure them because fighting back usually made things worse. Bumpy, Mamie, and their daughter were not doing anything unusual. They were simply walking, perhaps running errands, perhaps just spending time together. Bumpy was dressed well, as he always was. Mamie was elegant and composed. Their daughter was young, small, holding her mother's hand. They were not causing trouble. They were not drawing attention to themselves. They were just a black family moving through public space in a city that was theoretically open to everyone but practically hostile to people who looked like them. A white man approached them on the street. He was middle-aged, well-dressed, and appeared to be a businessman or someone of professional standing. He was not a criminal. He was not someone from Bumpy's world. He was an ordinary white citizen who felt entitled to say whatever he wanted to black people without consequences. This sense of entitlement was common. White people in the 1930s had been raised in a culture that taught them black people were inferior, that insulting them was acceptable, that black people had no recourse and no dignity that white people were bound to respect. The man walked directly toward Bumpy's family. He did not bump into them accidentally. He did not pass by without comment. He stopped, looked directly at Mamie, and spoke. He used a racial slur, clearly and loudly enough for people nearby to hear. Then he made a comment about their daughter. The exact words were not recorded in any reliable source, and repeating racial slurs serves no purpose. What matters is that the language was explicitly degrading and sexual in nature. It was designed to humiliate Mamie as a black woman and to suggest that even a young black girl could be spoken about in terms that were vile and dehumanizing. The insult was not random. It was calculated. The man wanted to assert his dominance, to remind Bumpy and his family that they were considered inferior, that they could be humiliated in public without consequence. He wanted to provoke a reaction, either submission or anger, both of which would have confirmed his sense of superiority. If Bumpy accepted the insult in silence, it would prove that black men were cowards who could not protect their families. If Bumpy responded with violence, the man could call the police and have Bumpy arrested, possibly beaten or killed. Either way, the white man would win, and the racial hierarchy would be reinforced. Witnesses to the incident later described a moment of tension that felt like it stretched much longer than it actually did. The street did not go silent, but people nearby stopped what they were doing. Some watched openly, curious or horrified. Others glanced and looked away, unwilling to involve themselves in something that could turn dangerous. A few white people smiled or smirked, enjoying the spectacle of a black man being put in his place. Some black people who witnessed it felt a wave of anger and helplessness. They knew what Bumpy was facing. They had faced similar situations themselves. They knew there was no good option. Mamie pulled their daughter closer, shielding her. The child was young enough that she might not have fully understood the words, but she understood the tone and the tension. She understood that something bad was happening. Mamie's face remained composed, but people who knew her said later that the humiliation and fear in that moment were visible in her eyes. She was a dignified woman being subjected to degradation in front of her child, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her husband's reputation, his power in the criminal world, meant nothing in this moment. The broader society did not recognize that power. The police would not defend her. The courts would not provide justice. She was vulnerable, and the white man knew it. Bumpy Johnson stood very still. His face showed no expression. He did not look away from the man, but he also did not move toward him. His hands remained at his sides. He did not speak immediately. The silence stretched out, and the white man seemed to become uncomfortable. He had expected a reaction by now. He had expected Bumpy to either cower or explode. But Bumpy did neither. He simply stood there, looking at the man with eyes that revealed nothing. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice was quiet. It was so quiet that people more than a few feet away could not hear the exact words, but the tone was clear. It was calm, controlled, and absolutely certain. Bumpy told the man that he had made a mistake. He did not threaten him explicitly. He did not describe what would happen. He simply made a statement of fact. The man had crossed a line, and there would be a consequence. That was all. No elaboration, no drama. Just a simple, clear message delivered in a voice that carried more weight than any shout. Then Bumpy turned. He put his hand on Mamie's back gently, guiding her forward. He looked down at his daughter and said something to her quietly, something reassuring, and they walked away. They did not run. They did not look back. They simply continued on their way, as if the encounter had already been resolved in Bumpy's mind, even though to everyone watching, it seemed like nothing had been resolved at all. The white man stood where he was. Some witnesses said he looked confused at first, as if he could not quite process what had just happened. Others said he looked uneasy, as if some survival instinct had finally kicked in and warned him that he had miscalculated. He did not follow Bumpy. He did not shout again. After a moment, he left the area, walking quickly. The encounter had lasted perhaps 90 seconds from start to finish, but in those 90 seconds, something had shifted. Though most of the witnesses did not yet understand what it was, news of the incident spread through Harlem with remarkable speed. By that evening, people in barbershops, bars, and corner stores were talking about it. The details were already beginning to vary. Some people said Bumpy had threatened the man directly. Others said he had said nothing at all. Some people claimed the insult had been even worse than it actually was. Others minimized it, perhaps because thinking about it too carefully was too painful. But everyone agreed on the basic facts. A white man had publicly insulted Bumpy Johnson's wife and daughter. Bumpy had not responded with immediate violence. And now people were waiting to see what would happen next. The reactions among Bumpy's associates and peers in the criminal world were mixed and revealing. Some men expected Bumpy to retaliate immediately and visibly. They thought he would find the man within hours and deliver a beating that would serve as a public message. That was the expected response in their world. Disrespect, especially disrespect involving family, demanded a visible answer. The logic was straightforward. If you did not respond to an insult, people would think you were weak. If people thought you were weak, they would test you. Once people started testing you, your authority would erode, and in the criminal world, loss of authority meant loss of income, safety, and ultimately life. But other men, particularly those who knew Bumpy well, were not so sure. They had seen him operate. They knew he did not follow predictable patterns. They knew he thought strategically rather than emotionally. They suspected that Bumpy had a plan, that his calm response at the scene was not submission, but calculation. These men waited, curious to see what form Bumpy's response would take. They trusted that there would be a response, because Bumpy was not a man who accepted disrespect. But they knew it might not look like what everyone expected. Days passed, then a week. There was no report of violence. No one heard about the white man being beaten or killed. No one saw Bumpy doing anything unusual. He continued his normal routines, conducting business, meeting with associates, moving through Harlem as he always did. To outsiders, it seemed like perhaps he had let the incident go. Perhaps the insult had been too public, too risky to respond to. Perhaps he had decided that protecting his family meant avoiding further confrontation. But people who were paying close attention noticed small things. They noticed that Bumpy was asking questions. Not obvious questions, not public questions, but quiet inquiries made to people who had access to information. He wanted to know who the white man was. He wanted to know where the man lived, where he worked, who his family was, what his habits were, who his friends and associates were. Bumpy was gathering intelligence, building a complete picture of someone's life. This took time and resources. It required people who could move through white areas of the city without drawing attention, people who could observe without being obvious, people who could compile information and deliver it accurately. Bumpy had access to these resources because he had built relationships across different communities. He knew black people who worked as servants or laborers in white neighborhoods and businesses, people who could watch and listen and report back. He knew some white people as well, criminals and others who owed him favors or who could be paid for information. He used this network carefully, making sure no one person had enough information to understand the full picture. This was standard operational security in the criminal world, but Bumpy applied it with unusual thoroughness. Within 2 weeks, Bumpy knew everything important about the white man's life. He knew the man's full name, though it was not widely shared, and does not appear in most historical accounts. He knew where the man lived, on which street, in which apartment. He knew the man worked in commerce, something related to wholesale goods or distribution. He knew the man had a family, though the details about his wife and children are not clear in the historical record. He knew the man's regular routines, where he ate lunch, which train he took home, which bars he frequented. He knew who the man's friends were, who he did business with, what debts he might have, what vulnerabilities existed in his life. Armed with this information, Bumpy made a choice that surprised even people who knew him well. He did not go after the man physically. He did not have him beaten or threatened directly. Instead, Bumpy initiated a campaign of psychological pressure that was subtle, sustained, and deeply unsettling. The goal was not to hurt the man's body, but to destroy his peace of mind, to make him understand that he was being watched and judged and held accountable in ways he could not escape. The campaign began with surveillance that was just visible enough to be noticed. The white man would leave his apartment in the morning and see someone standing across the street, not doing anything, not approaching, just standing there, watching. The person would be black, usually a young man, dressed ordinarily, not threatening in any obvious way. But the presence was deliberate. The man being watched would recognize that he was being observed. The watcher would not hide. He would make eye contact if the man looked his way, and then continue watching. This would happen regularly, but not every day. The unpredictability was part of the strategy. Some mornings, there would be someone watching. Other mornings, there would not. The man could never be sure. He could not establish a pattern or predict when the surveillance would occur. This uncertainty created constant anxiety. Every time he left his apartment, he had to wonder if someone would be watching. Every time he turned a corner, he had to look around to see if he was being followed. The surveillance extended beyond his home. The man would see the same face or different faces near his workplace. He would notice someone in a cafe where he ate lunch. He would see someone on the train platform during his commute. Again, these observers were not hiding. They were not threatening him directly. They were simply there, watching, making their presence known. The message was clear. Bumpy Johnson knew where this man went, what he did, and when he did it. The man's entire life was being mapped and monitored. After a few weeks of this, more direct messages began to arrive. The man might find a note slipped under his apartment door with information that should have been private. It might be a detail about a business transaction, or a reminder of where he had been on a specific day, or a reference to someone in his family. Nothing explicitly threatening. Nothing that he could take to the police and say, "Look, I am being harmed." But the implication was clear. Someone knew things they should not know. Someone had access to his life in ways that violated his sense of security and privacy. Phone calls came at odd hours. When the man answered, there might be silence on the other end. Or there might be a voice, calm and polite, asking if he remembered a particular afternoon, a particular incident, a particular family that he had insulted. Then the line would go dead. These calls were infrequent enough that the man could not establish a pattern, but frequent enough that he was always aware the phone might ring and bring another reminder that he was not free from consequences. The psychological impact of this campaign was profound. The man could not go to the police because no crime was being committed that he could easily describe. He was being watched, but watching someone in public is not illegal. He was receiving notes and phone calls, but the content was vague enough that it did not constitute a direct threat. He had no evidence that Bumpy Johnson was behind it, though he surely suspected. And even if he could prove it, what would the police do? A black criminal was making a white man uncomfortable. In the racial hierarchy of 1935 New York, that was not a priority for law enforcement, but more fundamentally, the man could not escape. He could not change his routines without disrupting his entire life. He had to go to work. He had to come home. He had to exist in the city. And at every turn, he was reminded that someone was watching, that someone had not forgotten, that the incident on the street had not been resolved simply because time had passed. This knowledge was corrosive. It ate away at his sense of safety and control. It made him constantly vigilant, constantly anxious, constantly aware that his actions had consequences that he could not outrun. For Bumpy Johnson, this approach required discipline and patience that most men in his position would not have possessed. It would have been easier and more emotionally satisfying to simply have the man beaten. It would have been quicker. It would have provided immediate release for Bumpy's anger and humiliation. But Bumpy understood that immediate satisfaction was not the same as effective power. A beating would have been a single event, over in minutes, leaving the man injured but eventually recovered. What Bumpy was doing instead was creating a permanent change in the man's life, a constant awareness that would never fully go away. This approach also sent a message to everyone else who was watching, and many people were watching. Word of what Bumpy was doing spread through Harlem's criminal networks. Men talked about it in private, analyzing his strategy, debating whether it was effective or excessive. Some admired the restraint and intelligence it demonstrated. They saw it as proof that Bumpy was operating on a level above simple street violence. They recognized that what he was doing required resources, organization, and patience that few people could sustain. Others were unsettled by it. They had been raised in a culture where masculine honor required immediate, visible responses to insults. Waiting, watching, applying psychological pressure rather than physical force seemed somehow less direct, less honest. These men were accustomed to violence that was clear and conclusive. What Bumpy was doing felt ambiguous, open-ended, impossible to measure. When did it end? How would anyone know when the debt had been paid? The lack of clear resolution made some men uncomfortable because it suggested that Bumpy might never consider the debt paid, that the surveillance and pressure might continue indefinitely. This discomfort was exactly what Bumpy wanted. He wanted other criminals to understand that crossing him would not result in a simple, predictable punishment. He wanted them to understand that he could sustain pressure over time, that he would not forget, that he would not be satisfied with easy answers. This made him more frightening than men who were merely violent. Violence has limits. Everyone understands violence. But this was something else. This was psychological warfare applied with criminal resources, and it was deeply unsettling to people who prided themselves on being tough and fearless. The white authorities in New York were also paying attention, though their reactions were complex and often contradictory. On one level, they did not care much about a dispute between a black criminal and a white civilian. If Bumpy had simply beaten the man, they would have arrested Bumpy and used it as an excuse to crack down on black criminal enterprises. If Bumpy had killed the man, it would have been even better from their perspective. It would have justified extensive police action, raids, arrests, and public statements about controlling black crime. But what Bumpy was actually doing created a different kind of problem. He was imposing consequences without giving authorities clear grounds for intervention. He was exercising power in ways that operated outside the legal system, but did not provide obvious violations that could be prosecuted. This was troubling because it suggested that black criminals were becoming more sophisticated, that they understood how to operate in the gaps between legal and illegal, that they could assert power without triggering the full force of police response. Some police officers and officials recognized that what Bumpy was doing was more dangerous in the long term than simple violence. Violence was easy to condemn and prosecute. Violence confirmed racist stereotypes about black people being primitive and uncontrolled. But what Bumpy was doing suggested intelligence, planning, and restraint. It suggested that black criminals could be just as sophisticated as white organized crime figures, that they could exercise power through psychological and social mechanisms rather than just physical force. This was an uncomfortable realization for white authorities, who preferred to think of black criminals as unsophisticated and easily controlled. The white press largely ignored the incident and its aftermath. There was no arrest, no spectacular violence, nothing that fit their narrative templates. A story about a black man responding to a racist insult with patient, calculated psychological pressure was too complex and too uncomfortable. It did not confirm stereotypes. It did not provide easy villains and victims. It suggested that race and power in New York were more complicated than the simple stories white readers wanted to consume. So the press said nothing, and the incident remained largely unknown outside Harlem and the criminal world. But within Harlem, the incident became a reference point, a story that people told to explain who Bumpy Johnson was and how he operated. Older people told younger people about it as a lesson in strategy and patience. Women talked about it as an example of how Bumpy protected his family's dignity in a world that constantly attacked it. Men in the criminal world analyzed it as a case study in power, discussing what worked, what risks Bumpy had taken, and whether his approach could be replicated. The white man at the center of the incident began to unravel under the sustained pressure. People who saw him in the weeks and months after the incident noticed changes. He looked tired and anxious. He was drinking more heavily. He was irritable and defensive. His work performance suffered. His relationships became strained. He could not explain to people what was happening because explaining meant admitting that he had publicly insulted a black man's family and was now paying a price for it. In the racist culture of 1935, admitting that a black man was making him afraid would have been its own form of humiliation. Eventually, the man made a decision. He left New York. The exact timeline is not clear in the historical record, but within a year of the incident, he was no longer living in the city. There is no evidence that he was physically harmed or that his family was threatened directly, but the psychological pressure had made his life in New York unbearable. He could not continue living with the constant awareness that he was being watched and judged and held accountable. So he left, probably telling people that it was for business reasons or family reasons, never admitting the real cause. For Bumpy Johnson, the man's departure was a victory, but not in the way that most people understood victory in the criminal world. Bumpy had not beaten him. He had not killed him. He had not stolen from him or destroyed his property. He had simply made it impossible for the man to live comfortably in the same city, and he had done so without giving authorities any grounds for prosecution. This was a demonstration of power that was subtle but profound. It showed that Bumpy could reach into white New York, that he could impose consequences on people who thought they were protected by the racial hierarchy, and that he could do so without triggering the kind of response that would destroy him. The incident also had effects on Bumpy's relationship with his own family. Mamie Johnson rarely spoke publicly about the incident in later years, but when she did, it was clear that it had been traumatic. She had been humiliated in public. Her daughter had been exposed to vile language. And she had been forced to confront the limits of her husband's ability to protect them. Bumpy could respond after the fact. He could impose consequences. But he could not prevent the initial insult. He could not make the streets of New York safe for his family in any absolute sense. This knowledge created a permanent tension in their relationship. Mamie loved Bumpy and stayed married to him for decades, but she also understood that being his wife meant accepting risks that never fully went away. For their daughter, the incident was formative in ways that shaped her entire understanding of race and power in America. She learned at a young age that even a powerful father could not fully protect his family from racism. She learned that black people, no matter how strong or successful, were still vulnerable to humiliation and violence simply because of their skin color. She learned that justice and fairness were not available through official channels, that her father had to create his own forms of accountability because the legal system would not provide them. These were harsh lessons for a child, but they were lessons that every black child in America had to learn in some form. The incident in 1935 became part of Bumpy Johnson's legend, but the legend often obscured what actually happened. In popular retellings, the story was simplified and dramatized. Some versions claimed that Bumpy had beaten the man savagely. Others said he had him killed. Some versions added elements of public confrontation and spectacle that did not occur. These distortions served a purpose. They made the story more exciting and more emotionally satisfying. They provided the kind of clear, violent resolution that audiences expected from crime stories. But the real story, the one that people who were there remembered, was more complex and more disturbing. It was a story about patience and psychological warfare. It was about a black man in a racist society finding ways to impose consequences without giving his enemies the ammunition they needed to destroy him. It was about understanding systems and exploiting their weaknesses. It was about power that operated in shadows and through indirect channels, power that was more sustainable than spectacular violence. For younger criminals in Harlem who were watching and learning, the incident provided a different kind of education than most crime stories offered. It taught them that the most effective power was not always the most visible. It taught them that patience could be more valuable than rage. It taught them that understanding your enemies, learning their vulnerabilities, and applying pressure systematically could achieve results that violence alone could not. These were lessons that stayed with people. Frank Lucas, who would become one of the most successful drug traffickers of the 1960s and 70s, often spoke about learning from Bumpy Johnson. He mentioned Bumpy's discipline, his strategic thinking, and his ability to control situations through intelligence rather than just force. The incident also revealed something about the nature of racism in 1930s America. The white man who insulted Bumpy's family felt entitled to do so because he believed the social and legal systems would protect him. He believed that black people had no recourse, that they would either accept the insult or respond in ways that would justify punishment. He was wrong, but his mistake was based on a rational assessment of how things usually worked. Usually, white people could insult black people with impunity. Usually, the systems of power protected white citizens and punished black resistance. The fact that this particular incident had a different outcome did not change the broader pattern. It was an exception, not a new rule. But exceptions matter. They matter because they show what is possible when people refuse to accept the roles assigned to them. They matter because they create space for imagination, for thinking about how power could work differently. The incident in 1935 did not end racism in New York. It did not make black people safe from insults and violence, but it did show that even within a racist system, there were ways to assert dignity and impose consequences. These ways were not always legal or morally pure. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal, and his methods involved intimidation and surveillance that could be used to harm innocent people. But in the specific context of this incident, his response resonated with people who were tired of accepting humiliation without reply. Historians studying Bumpy Johnson's life have often focused on his later years, when he was more established and more powerful, when he was involved in conflicts with Italian organized crime families, and when he was mentoring younger criminals. But the incident in 1935 deserves attention because it reveals something about how he built his reputation and his power. It shows that he was willing to invest time and resources in responses that were not immediately profitable. It shows that he understood the symbolic importance of defending his family's dignity. It shows that he could think strategically, even when dealing with deeply personal attacks. The incident also has broader significance for understanding crime and race in American history. Most crime narratives focus on violence, on spectacular confrontations, and clear villains and heroes. But much of criminal power operates more quietly, through networks of information, through psychological pressure, through the ability to make people understand that actions have consequences, even when those consequences are delayed and indirect. Bumpy Johnson's response to the incident in 1935 is an example of this quieter form of power, and it is worth studying because it reveals aspects of criminal strategy that are often overlooked. For the people of Harlem who lived through the 1930s, the incident was one small part of a much larger struggle. They were fighting for dignity and survival in a city and a country that denied them basic respect and rights. Some of that fight happened through legal means, through civil rights organizations, and community activism. Some of it happened through cultural expression, through the music and art and literature that asserted black humanity and creativity. And some of it happened through the criminal underground, through people like Bumpy Johnson who used illegal means to carve out space and power that the legal system denied them. This is not to romanticize or justify criminality. Bumpy Johnson caused harm through his involvement in illegal enterprises. The policy operations he was connected to exploited poor people's dreams and took money that could have been used for necessities. The violence he participated in, even when restrained and strategic, destroyed lives. Any assessment of his life must acknowledge these facts. But it is also important to acknowledge that he operated in a context where legal paths to power and dignity were largely closed to black people. This does not excuse his actions, but it does help explain them. The incident in 1935 represents a moment when those contradictions were particularly visible. A black man who was denied legal recourse for a racist attack on his family used criminal resources and methods to impose his own form of justice. The result was not just or fair in any absolute sense. The psychological torture of sustained surveillance was cruel, regardless of the initial provocation. But within the specific context of a racist society that offered no other forms of accountability, Bumpy's response made sense to many people. It made sense because it demonstrated that even powerless people can find ways to assert power when they are creative and determined enough. New York in 1935 was a city of deep inequalities and tensions. The Great Depression had hit black communities particularly hard. Unemployment was higher among black workers. Poverty was more severe. Housing conditions were worse. Police brutality was routine. And through it all, black people were expected to accept their situation with patience and humility, to not complain, to not resist, to not demand better. The incident involving Bumpy Johnson and the white man was tiny in the scope of all the injustices happening in the city. But it mattered because it showed resistance. It showed that not everyone would accept humiliation quietly. It showed that consequences were possible, even when the official systems of justice refused to provide them. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about the incident. He was not someone who sought publicity or who explained his actions to outsiders. He operated on the principle that power demonstrated through actions needed no verbal justification. The fact that the white man left New York spoke for itself. The fact that people in Harlem heard the story and understood its implications spoke for itself. Bumpy did not need to give interviews or make statements.